Family dinners aren't always about food. Sometimes they're about life-changing decisions. That thought kept circling in my head as I replayed that evening in my mind. For most people, sitting down at the table with loved ones means laughter, small arguments about who gets the last piece of bread, and conversations that range from random gossip to plans for the week ahead. But for me, that dinner was something else entirely. It wasn't just about the flavors on the table or the warmth of being surrounded by family. It was about a decision that was made without me, about me, in front of me, as though my voice didn't even exist. When I first walked into the dining room, I wasn't expecting anything unusual. The table was set the way it always was. My mom had placed her best dishes in the center, my dad sat in his usual seat, and my sister already had her phone out, scrolling and half smiling at whatever she was reading. It felt familiar, almost comforting. I thought it would be another ordinary evening where we'd eat, argue lightly about chores, maybe talk about some distant relatives, and then go our separate ways. But the truth is, sometimes the most ordinary moments become the stage for the biggest shocks. The smell of food lingered in the air: roasted chicken, buttery mashed potatoes, and warm bread fresh from the oven. Everything looked perfect. I remember sitting down, pulling my chair closer, and tucking my napkin on my lap like always. But there was something different in the way my parents looked at each other. Their eyes carried a weight I didn't understand at first. It was like they had already rehearsed what they were about to say, like the lines of a play they had written together. We started eating, and conversation flowed like it usually did. My mom asked me about work. My dad made a sarcastic joke about the economy. My sister rolled her eyes, complaining about how hard her classes were. It felt routine until suddenly it didn't. My mom put her fork down, folded her hands neatly, and gave my dad that silent nod, the one she always used when she wanted him to say something serious. He cleared his throat, and I could already sense that the air in the room was about to shift. He didn't waste any time. He said it bluntly, almost casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "We've decided your sister will be moving into your apartment." The words landed on me like a punch, but they were delivered so matter-of-factly, so calmly, that for a second I wondered if I had heard them right. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. My mind tried to process it, but everything around me, the clinking of utensils, my sister's small smirk, my mom's patient silence, suddenly felt far away. I remember looking at my parents, waiting for an explanation, waiting for them to tell me it was just an idea, a suggestion, something we could talk about. But their faces didn't show hesitation. They had already made their decision, and I was just supposed to accept it. They hadn't asked me if I was okay with it. They hadn't even hinted at the idea before. They had sat together, decided my living space wasn't really mine to begin with, and then dropped it on me at dinner like it was a harmless piece of family news. My sister didn't even look guilty. In fact, she looked pleased, like she had known about this all along, like the whole thing had been planned without me in the loop. That stung more than anything, realizing that the three of them had already had this conversation, already made their choice, and I was the last one to know. It wasn't just about the apartment. It was about what it represented. My apartment was my independence, my sanctuary, the place where I made the rules. It was my escape from all the expectations that came with living under my parents' roof. And suddenly, in just a few words, it was stripped away. I sat there in silence, staring at the food on my plate. My appetite vanished, replaced by this hollow feeling in my chest. Family dinners are supposed to bring people closer, to remind you of love and belonging. But in that moment, I didn't feel closer. I felt cornered. The same table where we had celebrated birthdays and laughed over silly stories was now the place where my autonomy had been dismissed in the most casual, dismissive way. It's strange how quickly a familiar environment can feel foreign. The chicken didn't taste the same anymore. The laughter around the table felt forced. The warmth of family felt like pressure closing in. That night, I realized something important. Family dinners may look like they're about food, comfort, and togetherness, but sometimes they carry decisions that change the very foundation of who you are and what you call your own. Parents suddenly announced my sister would be moving into my apartment. Those words still echo in my mind, sharp and uninvited, as though they had been rehearsed before being handed to me. It was a decision wrapped in calm voices, but to me, it felt like a storm. The way my father said it, steady and without hesitation, carried the weight of finality, as though there was no room for discussion, no opening for my thoughts. My mother sat beside him, her hands folded neatly on the table, her face betraying no doubt, only quiet confirmation. And my sister, sitting across from me, almost smiled, not out of gratitude, but out of entitlement, as if this had always been her right. I stared at them in disbelief. My apartment had been the only corner of the world I could truly call my own. I had worked hard to maintain it, to keep it as a space that reflected me, my choices, my effort, my independence. It wasn't just four walls, it was where I could breathe freely, away from expectations and obligations. Yet, in that single announcement, my parents acted like it was theirs to give away, a property on loan, something I had been merely borrowing until they decided otherwise. Their tone was matter-of-fact, as though it were the simplest solution to a problem I hadn't even been told existed. What stung most was the casualness of it. No one had pulled me aside beforehand. No one had asked how I felt. They dropped it in the middle of dinner like it was just another piece of conversation, like passing the salt across the table. I remember the way my fork trembled slightly in my hand, my appetite vanishing the moment the words landed. I wanted to speak, to protest, but my voice caught somewhere between anger and shock. How could they make such a decision about my life, my space, without even the decency of including me? My sister leaned back in her chair, her eyes gleaming with a smug satisfaction that made my stomach turn. She didn't even pretend to be surprised. She didn't look at me with apology or guilt. No, she looked at me like she had already won. And maybe, in that moment, she had. Because she knew our parents wouldn't go back on what they said. She knew their word was final. She knew I had been blindsided, and she enjoyed watching me struggle to find words. It wasn't about the apartment alone, though that mattered more to me than they seemed to understand. It was about what it represented. That apartment was where I had learned to stand on my own feet, to pay my own bills, to make mistakes and fix them without anyone hovering over me. It was my safe space, the place I returned to after long days, where I could shut the door and feel like I was in control of my life. And now my parents had reduced it to a convenience, a solution to their problem of where my sister should stay. To them, it was just space. To me, it was freedom. The silence that followed their announcement was suffocating. My father reached for his glass, sipping water as though nothing monumental had been said. My mother cut another piece of chicken, calm and composed. My sister scrolled on her phone again, her lips twitching upward in a smirk she couldn't quite hide. And me? I sat there frozen, my thoughts racing, my chest tightening with every second that passed. I kept asking myself if I had heard it wrong, if maybe there was some detail I had missed. But no. The reality was plain. My parents had decided, and in their eyes, there was nothing left to discuss. I thought about all the nights I had spent decorating that apartment, the countless hours of making it feel like home, the effort of building a life in it. I thought about the rent I paid, the groceries I stocked, the routines I had built within those walls. And then I thought about my sister moving in, filling the space with her noise, her demands, her disregard for boundaries. The image of her in my living room, using my things as if they were hers, made me feel like I was already being pushed out of my own life. At that table, I realized how little my independence meant to them. In their minds, family decisions outweighed individual ones. They saw me not as someone who had carved out a life of my own, but as an extension of their household, someone whose autonomy could be rearranged whenever it suited them. My apartment was never fully mine in their eyes. It was always theirs to control. That realization cut deeper than the announcement itself. I glanced at each of them, searching for any sign of hesitation, any crack in their certainty, but found none. My father's expression was firm, my mother's was settled, and my sister's was smugly content. And me, sitting in that chair, felt smaller than ever, as if the walls of the dining room were closing in, leaving me with no space to breathe, no space to claim as my own. My safe space, my independence, stripped away without my consent. That is exactly how it felt when my parents made their decision about my apartment. For years, I had treated that space as more than just a roof over my head. It wasn't just about walls, furniture, or a bed to sleep in. It was about the sense of ownership, the pride of knowing that every detail inside reflected me. The books stacked in the corner, the dishes I washed late at night after cooking for myself, the little decorations I had chosen because they made me feel comfortable, they all carried pieces of me. That apartment was my sanctuary, the one place where no one dictated what I should do, where I could shut the world out and simply exist on my own terms. And then, without even asking me, my parents decided it was no longer mine to control. The shock of having something so personal taken away without warning was overwhelming. It wasn't just the fact that they assigned my sister to live there, it was the way they did it, as if my consent was unnecessary, as if my independence had limits defined by them. The words had barely left their mouths before I felt that strange hollow feeling in my chest, the kind that comes when something you've worked for suddenly slips from your hands. It was like they reached into my life and pulled out the one piece that truly belonged to me. For so long, I had associated that apartment with freedom. It was where I had first learned the weight of responsibility, paying bills on time, cleaning up after myself, staying up late to finish work, and waking up early even when no one was around to remind me. Those small things meant more than anyone realized. They were proof that I could manage on my own, that I wasn't just the child sitting at their dinner table anymore. Yet in their eyes, it seemed I hadn't earned that independence. They treated the apartment like it was theirs to give away, dismissing all the effort I had poured into making it mine. My sister didn't care about any of this. To her, it was just a convenient move, a way to avoid the discomfort of finding her own place or managing her own expenses. She didn't think about the meaning that space held for me, the quiet nights I had spent there building a life. She only saw it as an opportunity handed to her, one she felt entitled to accept without hesitation. Watching her sit at the dinner table with that satisfied expression made me realize how invisible my struggle must have seemed to her. What hurt even more was the lack of acknowledgement from my parents. They didn't pause to ask how I felt. They didn't recognize the effort I had put into maintaining that apartment. To them, it was as though I had been keeping it warm until they decided to pass it on. Their voices carried certainty, the kind that left no room for discussion. It was almost as though they believed my independence was temporary, conditional on their approval. That thought gnawed at me, because I had worked so hard to prove otherwise. I thought about all the moments that space had given me. The quiet mornings when I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the sun rise without anyone interrupting. The evenings when I played music too loud, not worried about bothering anyone. The nights when I cooked just for myself, even if it was something simple, and felt proud that I could. Those small rituals made the apartment more than a place to stay. They made it a reflection of my journey toward becoming my own person. Having that stripped away without my consent made me feel like none of it mattered, like I was just borrowing time until they decided otherwise. There was a deep kind of loneliness in realizing that the people closest to me didn't see my independence the way I did. To them, I was still their child, someone whose choices could be overridden when necessary. But to me, that apartment was proof that I had grown beyond that role. It represented nights of sacrifice, days of hard work, and the quiet pride of surviving on my own. Losing that, or rather having it taken from me without my agreement, made me question how much control I really had over my own life. I sat at that dinner table, surrounded by familiar faces, but the room felt colder than ever. My safe space wasn't safe anymore. My independence wasn't respected. And the hardest part was knowing I hadn't given it away. It had been taken, casually, as if my consent had never mattered in the first place. Shock and silence became my only response in that moment. I wish I could say I stood up for myself right then, that I spoke out and challenged the unfairness of what was being decided for me, but the truth is I froze. It was as if the words my father spoke had sucked all the air out of the room. My mouth went dry, my thoughts scattered, and though my chest burned with the need to object, no sound came out. I just sat there, staring at my plate, my fork hovering uselessly in my hand, unable to process the reality of what had just been said. Silence can feel heavy, heavier than shouting sometimes. It hangs in the air, pressing down on you, filling every corner of the room. That's what I felt sitting at that dinner table, surrounded by the clinking of utensils and the occasional casual comment from my family, as if nothing monumental had just happened. My sister didn't even look at me directly, though I could feel her smugness radiating from across the table. My parents acted like they had made a reasonable announcement, like they were expecting me to nod and move on. My silence became the approval they wanted, even though inside me every thought screamed against it. It wasn't that I didn't have words. I had too many. Anger, betrayal, confusion, disappointment, they all collided in my mind at once, crowding each other out until nothing coherent could come through. I wanted to ask them how they could make this decision without me, why they thought it was acceptable to strip away my independence, what gave them the right to treat my life as if it were theirs to rearrange. But those questions stayed trapped inside, choking me, while my parents carried on as though the matter had been settled. That silence of mine became a kind of prison. It held me in place, kept me from defending myself, made me complicit in something I never agreed to. I kept replaying the scene in my head even as I sat there. If I spoke now, would it make a difference? Would my father change his tone? Would my mother finally look at me and realize the weight of what they had done? Or had they already decided so firmly that my words, no matter how passionate, would slide off them like water off glass? The fear that my voice wouldn't matter made it harder to find the courage to use it. The shock, too, was paralyzing. I hadn't expected to walk into that dinner and have my world rearranged in a single sentence. I thought it was going to be an ordinary evening, food, conversation, maybe some light arguments, nothing more. But that announcement tore through my expectations, leaving me scrambling to adjust, and my mind couldn't catch up fast enough. Shock is strange like that. It doesn't always make you explode or demand answers. Sometimes it shuts you down completely, leaving you stuck in place, watching your life shift around you while you stay quiet. My sister's reaction only deepened that silence. She sat there with her phone in hand, clearly satisfied, clearly knowing this was a victory she didn't have to fight for. If I had spoken then, it would have been against not just my parents, but her smug certainty as well. The thought of trying to argue when they all seemed aligned made me feel outnumbered. My silence became a shield, weak and fragile, but the only one I had in that moment. I thought of all the things I could have said later that night. I thought of the anger I could have poured out, the boundaries I could have drawn, the truth I could have demanded they see. But in that moment, sitting at the dinner table, all I could do was stay frozen, because the shock of being so disregarded and the weight of that silence pressed too hard on me. My independence, my space, my effort, all of it had been brushed aside with a single decision, and my silence made it seem like I had agreed. Even as the meal continued, I barely touched my food. I kept replaying the words in my mind, hearing them again and again, as if repetition could make them make sense. My parents carried on with their small talk, as though they hadn't just dropped a bomb in the middle of dinner. And my silence allowed them to. It was the silence of someone blindsided, someone caught between anger and disbelief, someone who didn't yet know how to speak up against the people they were supposed to trust most. That silence sat with me, heavy and unrelenting, as the dinner dragged on. But silence led me to make a bold, unexpected choice. It was the kind of decision that didn't come from calm reasoning or careful planning, but from a deep place inside me that refused to keep being overlooked. I had sat there at the dinner table, my words trapped, my independence slipping through my fingers, and though I hadn't spoken in that moment, the silence became fuel. It turned into something sharp, something that pushed me toward action I never thought I would take. Sometimes when you're silenced, the only way left to speak is through what you do. At first, I wrestled with guilt. Was I being unreasonable for wanting to protect what was mine? My parents had framed the decision as if it were practical, even generous. My sister needed a place, they said, and I already had one. To them, it was a matter of family responsibility. But to me, it was theft disguised as fairness. Every time I thought about it, my chest tightened with frustration. They had taken away my right to decide for myself, and my silence at the table had only made it worse. That guilt quickly transformed into determination. If they weren't going to let me have a voice, then I would carve out one in the only way I could, through an action so unexpected they would have no choice but to notice. The thought lingered in my mind for days. My sister had already made plans to move in, as if everything had been finalized. She didn't ask me if it was okay. She didn't thank me. She acted like it was already hers. Watching her pack and talk about her future in my space made me realize I couldn't just sit back and allow it to happen. That was when the idea took root. If they were going to impose her into my life without my consent, then I would take control by removing myself from the situation entirely. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about reclaiming a sense of power. My silence at the dinner table had left me powerless, and this was the only way I knew how to take that power back. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I didn't owe them compliance. I didn't owe my sister the comfort of moving into a home she hadn't worked for. What I owed myself was the dignity of standing up for what was mine, even if my way of doing it didn't look traditional. The boldness of the decision scared me at first. It meant stepping into the unknown, taking risks I hadn't considered before. But it also thrilled me, because for the first time since that dinner, I felt like I was in control again. That feeling was addictive. I couldn't undo the silence that night, but I could use it to shape what came next. Every time I imagined the look on their faces when they realized I had acted on my own terms, a small spark of satisfaction lit inside me. It was a quiet kind of rebellion, the kind no one expected from me. I was always the one who followed rules, who stayed calm, who respected the boundaries set by my parents. They didn't think I was capable of stepping out of line. But their decision had pushed me to a place where silence could no longer hold me back. The choice I made was born out of that pressure, out of the realization that if I didn't act now, I would lose more than just an apartment. I would lose the sense of myself I had fought to build. Even in the moments of doubt, when I wondered if I was making a mistake, I reminded myself of that dinner table. I remembered the way they had spoken over me, dismissed me, decided for me. I remembered my sister's smirk, my parents' certainty, the suffocating weight of being ignored. Those memories silenced my doubts. They reminded me why I had to follow through, why boldness was my only option. My silence had been their weapon, but now it was turning into my shield, my way of creating an outcome they could not control. The choice wasn't loud or dramatic in the beginning. It unfolded quietly, in steps no one noticed at first. But inside me, it felt seismic. It was the first time I truly acted outside of their shadow, the first time I let my silence transform into strength. What they had mistaken as submission became the very thing that pushed me toward independence stronger than before. It wasn't just about resisting their decision anymore. It was about proving to myself that I didn't have to live defined by their choices. My silence had set the stage, but my decision was going to rewrite the script entirely. Instead of me, a stranger opened the door for my sister. That moment replayed in my head over and over, a scene so vivid it felt like a movie I couldn't stop watching. I had pictured how it would go countless times, my sister arriving with her bags, expecting me to greet her, expecting me to step aside and let her take over the space I had built. She thought it would be effortless, that she could walk into my life and rearrange it without resistance. But the reality was far different, because when she came to claim what she thought was hers, she didn't find me waiting. She found someone else, someone she didn't recognize, turning the handle and stepping into the space she assumed was already hers. The look on her face was something I can still imagine perfectly. Confusion at first, then irritation, and finally disbelief. She had walked in certain of her victory, certain that everything had been arranged in her favor, only to be confronted with the presence of a stranger. This wasn't what my parents had promised her. This wasn't the scene she had imagined. She thought she was inheriting something secure, only to realize it was no longer mine to give, and no longer hers to take. The choice to let a stranger open that door hadn't come lightly. It was born out of all the silence, all the shock, all the frustration that had been bottled up inside me since that dinner. I had spent days thinking about what my parents had done, how they had stripped me of my independence without hesitation, how my sister had smirked at my silence as though it were surrender. I could have handed the keys over, could have allowed her to settle in while I quietly disappeared into the background. But that would have meant betraying myself. Instead, I chose another path, one they never saw coming. Handing that apartment to a stranger was my way of breaking their expectations. It was proof that my space wasn't theirs to assign, proof that I could still control what happened within those four walls. It wasn't about being cruel or reckless. It was about taking back the narrative they had written for me. They thought I would stay passive, that my silence meant I would accept whatever they decided. By letting someone else step into my place, I shattered that assumption. I showed them that my silence had never been submission, it had been preparation. I imagined my sister standing there in the hallway, suitcase in hand, staring at someone she didn't know occupying what she thought was already hers. The sting of that realization must have been sharp. For once, she was the one blindsided. For once, she was the one left speechless. She would run back to my parents, her voice shrill with outrage, demanding to know why the plan had fallen apart. And in that chaos, the truth would settle in. They had underestimated me. That stranger at the door became more than just a tenant or a passerby. They became a symbol of my defiance, a silent messenger delivering the statement I hadn't been able to say at the dinner table. This is mine to decide, not yours. My sister could complain, my parents could argue, but the reality was unshakable. By the time they realized what I had done, the decision had already been made, the door already opened, the space already claimed by someone outside their control. There was power in that image. For so long, I had felt powerless, suffocated by their decisions, trapped by my own silence. But the moment that stranger opened the door, I felt something shift. It was a reminder that even in the face of family pressure, even when your voice is silenced, you still hold choices no one can take from you. My parents might have thought they could assign my life as if it were theirs to manage, but they couldn't predict every move I would make. That door, opened by someone else, was proof that I had found a way to turn their certainty upside down. The scene itself was simple, almost ordinary, a hand on a doorknob, the creak of hinges, the threshold crossed. But behind it was everything I hadn't been able to say. It carried the weight of my frustration, the depth of my independence, and the boldness of reclaiming what was mine. My sister might never forget the shock she felt standing there, confronted by a reality she hadn't planned for. And I would never forget the quiet satisfaction of knowing that in the end, my choice had spoken louder than any words I could have said that night at the dinner table.